Aí eu começo a falar, é isso?
O Bruno vai te dar um sinal.
Mas eu não estou vendo o Bruno, aí que está o problema.
Ele já vai voltar e vai aparecer, pessoal.
Ah, ok.
Já pode começar.
Pode?
Pode.
Bom dia a todos. Eu sou Paulo Bus, diretor do Centro de Relações Internacionais de Saúde da Fiocruz. Desde já, quero iniciar agradecendo a audiência a mais esse seminário que nós estamos realizando dentro de um conjunto de seminários intitulado Seminários Avançados em Saúde Global e Diplomacia da Saúde, José Roberto Ferreira. É um conjunto de seminários que o CRIS está organizando para discutir, por ocasião dessa pandemia, que agora estamos todos já chamando de sindemia, né? E rapidamente vamos poder discutir do que se trata. Esses seminários procuram trazer ao debate da comunidade brasileira de saúde, particularmente ao pessoal de saúde pública, mas aberto a todos os interessados nesse tema tão fascinante, tão desafiador, que é o tema da saúde internacional, das relações entre países. E esse seminário de hoje intitula-se Diplomacia da Saúde Mais Necessária do que Nunca, ou, em inglês, Health Diplomacy Now More Than Ever. Esse tema é extremamente importante porque, exatamente pela ausência dele nesse momento, nós estamos vivenciando na América Latina o pico da epidemia, tanto na região quanto a pandemia, ela tem o seu ápice nesse momento na nossa região, nas Américas, e particularmente na América Latina.
America, because of its major social and economic inequality, it's been suffering, and the most vulnerable populations have been suffering even more the consequences of this pandemic, not only the consequences for life and death of people, and the pain, the family's pain, but also on the issue of social life, economic life, and the psychological suffering that people and families have been suffering, and also the consequences that this pandemic has brought and will bring for life as a whole on the planet, and also specifically because of the severity here in the Latin American region, the impact that it has and will have on the Latin American region. And in Latin America specifically, we're experiencing a major crisis of plurilateralism or multilateralism, i.e. ever since Zona Sul was liquidated by the conservative governments, we have been left with the South American Union, we have the CELAC and the Southern Cone Common Market, and the Andean Community, the Central American Integration, CARICOM, but all of them have a major fragmentation here in the region as a whole. CELAC is unable to be the interaction or the combination of different regional blocks. Neither is it able to be, because of difficulty in taking off, neither it has been the structure capable of sewing together and combining a collective effort by the Latin American countries in their response to the COVID-19 pandemic and its consequences on economic, social life here in our region. Therefore, this seminar is extremely important, and we've invited people, renowned experts, to debate with you, all of us, this theme of global health diplomacy now more than ever. And we've invited a major friend of Brazil, a great friend of the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation, a great friend, a personal friend of ours, who's Professor Ilona Kickbusch, who we'll be announcing in just a minute. We've also invited our, let's say properly, the Dean of Global Health and Global Health Diplomacy, Professor Célia Almeida from the National School of Public Health, the full professor at the National School of Public Health, who has led for years the field of global health and global health diplomacy and training people for Brazil through her numerous initiatives and numerous articles and countless articles and books, which she has published with such great care, and she's a reference for all of us. And the third and guest speaker, let's say outside, strictly speaking, the field of health, who is Ambassador Santiago Alcázar. Of course, Santiago Alcázar is known to all of us to the extent that he was for years the director and head and coordinator of the area of international affairs in health in the Ministry of Health here in Brazil. And he was later ambassador in Burkina Faso and Azerbaijan. And we've made great effort, and we want to thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Brazil for having let us invite him to work with us here in global health diplomacy. You're going to see that the choice was not random. The choice was hand-picked, and you will realize through the quality of the speakers how much we will benefit today from the privilege of having these three main speakers on this important topic, and more necessary than ever in international relations to confront the pandemic by the countries as a whole here in the region, in Europe, Africa, and all regions of the world. In places where the fight against the pandemic has worked better, we've seen that the relations between countries also have worked better. The countries were not isolated in confronting the pandemic, and the result was much better in some regions of the world than in others. We are experiencing now a severe period of denial and undervaluation of multilateralism in the United Nations and other multilateral organizations. America first, unfortunately, is a reality, and a powerful country like the United States, we're missing the fact that its international relations need to be proactive and favorable to multilateralism, because the importance of the United States. Europe has given major contributions, and the European Union, but all of this, I'm talking here, and the speakers are the ones who should be speaking, our guest speakers, and specifically, I want to thank the three of them. And I wish to say, finally, but no less important, is that this seminar is a joint seminar between the Global Health Center at Fiocruz and our dear National Brazilian Association of Collective Health, Abrasco, which has been a brave institution here in the defense of life and the defense of the unified health system and the promotion of an adequate response to this system. They've made a plan, a wonderful plan for quality and suggestions for government authorities to position themselves better in confronting the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to thank the president of Abrasco, Professor Gulnar Azevedo, and I also want to salute Luis Eugenio, who is the coordinator of international cooperation at Abrasco, and to say how happy we are at the Global Center with Abrasco to be sponsoring this seminar and organizing it. So I want to turn the floor over to Ilona. I just wish to announce that and say who our guest speaker is, and a few words about her curriculum. And Ilona Kickbusch is a political scientist. She was born in Germany. She lives in Switzerland. Over her academic and professional career, she's given extremely important contribution to health promotion, global health, and health diplomacy. And she was one of the drafters of the Ottawa Health Promotion Charter. Of course, you said that she gave me one. I have it as a souvenir, this example of health promotion, this copy And I never tire of saying and thanking and remembering the gift that you gave me, the copy of the declaration. She's the founder and director of the Global Health Center and Graduate Studies, International Affairs, and Development at Geneva. She created it, and she's the director of the Global Health Center there for many years. Ilona, she worked at the WHO at Yale. She worked in the PAHO as well, and recognition given to her by the government of her country, the Order of Merit of Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany. I was going to dare to say it in German, but it's very difficult to pronounce. And Ilona, you can tell us the word in German, which is a tribute to her, recognition of her huge contribution to innovation in the fields of global health and global health governments and global health diplomacy. She's the author of hundreds of publications in health promotion, global health diplomacy, the best journals. One of them had the privilege of being co-author of 3 of these articles, and dozens of books where Santiago himself and myself have chapters which Ilona included us in. She's preparing a book. It's called A Handbook of Global Health, and we had access to this book, and we are going to commit to translating it into Portuguese, which will be an extraordinary incentive and contribution for people from health and people in diplomacy who are interested in the field of global health diplomacy. Therefore, thank you once again, Ilona, and you have the floor now.
Thank you very, very much, Paulo, for inviting me. And of course, I'm dreadfully homesick. I wish I could be with you. I have such great experiences, both of working, of course, with you and the colleagues at Fiocruz, but also the fantastic conferences you have organized and enabled. And one, of course, that's particularly important for what we are discussing now, the big conference on the social determinants of health, which of course are coming to the fore now again with the COVID-19 pandemic. While we're putting up the PowerPoints that I've prepared for my talk, I hope that will work. I will pronounce the word you couldn't pronounce, which is one of these long German words, which is called Bundesverdienstkreuz. So I challenge everyone who speaks Portuguese to try and to be able to do that. I'm also delighted that this is an opportunity to meet Célia and Santiago again. We've not seen each other quite for some time, and particularly Santiago, who was so active in the WHO and who was so supportive to many of the important global health negotiations. And I'm sure in his presentation and response, he will refer to this. So I have followed the title I was given, Global Health Diplomacy, More Important Than Ever. And I do think that is the case because really part of the future of the world now hinges on successful global health diplomacy. And it is quite shocking and also very distressing that some of the key actors are not engaging or are sowing discord, and we'll speak more about that. I have highlighted on my next slide an important quote from the present Director General of the WHO. It says, global health security is only as strong as its weakest link. No one is safe until everyone is safe. And I want to say here that of course, I am very familiar, and particularly with the Portuguese colleagues, that health security can be a very contested term. I want to highlight that increasingly health security is understood in the way that we understand social security. It is a concept that expresses solidarity. It is not a concept that is supposed to express nationalism, national security, or militarized approaches to global health. That is not something we want. We want an approach that is based on solidarity, of all countries and all peoples with one another. But this is also a signal that much of health diplomacy has now been, in a way, taken over by very important issues related to COVID-19. But at the same time, in this dynamic, what we see is that the debate on COVID-19 is actually bringing global health diplomacy to the fore, including a number of the issues that we have tried to push into the discussions over the last 20 years or so. You see here one of the very, very many definitions of global health diplomacy, but basically it's about multiple actors, and particularly in the multilateral space, to work together, and I like this phrase, to orchestrate global policy solutions to improve global health. We're very clear about the fact that people have interests, that countries have interests, that organizations have interests, but the intention of diplomacy in general and of global health diplomacy in particular is to bring those interests together, to find a form of consensus that can bring everyone forward together. And the very worrying thing, as I've already indicated, is that this premise of global health diplomacy, meaning everyone has interests, but we bring our interests to the table and we try to find a solution, presently is broken. And it is broken because particularly one of the key actors in global health diplomacy that supported the multilateral system, meaning the United States of America, is not, let me call it this way, playing the game anymore. So we see also through this that health diplomacy, global health diplomacy, like all diplomacy, is political because it is about interests, political interests, economic interests, and it's very essentially a political process. And that political process, of course, takes place in many, many different spheres and increasingly at different levels. And you see here some of the venues in which this happens, of course, the World Health Assembly, the Executive Board, but also you see the famous picture of Angela Merkel, my chancellor, with the members of the G20 on occasion of a meeting. You see that increasingly one of the G20 members, China, as you see on one of the other pictures, is playing an increasingly important and global role in health diplomacy, something that was not the case even 5 years ago. If we look at this challenge that comes through that to the World Health Organization, we can say that despite the many subject areas, if we go to the next slide, the many subject areas that WHO deals with, right at this stage, the work of WHO is incredibly COVID driven. If you just think of the fact that since early this year, the Director General of the WHO has held 110 press conferences with the attempt to brief the global community on the developments, on the science, on the politics of COVID-19. You can just get a feeling for how much the organization is presently being driven through this and what effort it must develop to make sure that other issues are not falling from the table, because obviously people are still dying of many other diseases, of HIV/AIDS, of tuberculosis, of heart disease. And this mix of being COVID driven and being subject to a new geopolitic that I hope Santiago will also talk more about leads us to call the COVID virus, or the coronavirus, I should say, a politvirus. Rarely have we really had in front of our eyes just how political health and disease is. So what is changing? I've listed some of those changes and tried to illustrate them on the next slide. Very much diplomacy and foreign policy are changing in many ways. And also before COVID, it was clear that diplomacy that had been, you know, a very staid profession, actually quite a conservative profession, a very, very male profession, was changing to have, you know, new methods, new outreach, public diplomacy, many more women in diplomacy, and even such a thing, you see one example here, first starting in the Nordic countries in Sweden, but taken up by Canada and others, the expression of actually saying we want a feminist foreign policy, a foreign policy that's less focused on military aspects, that takes into account people's well-being, etc. Multilateralism is changing very much, particularly in terms of many of the other players that have entered the multilateral space aside from nation states. I've mentioned that geopolitics is back, but also what we must have in mind is that the countries of the South are gaining a much, much stronger voice in diplomacy and also in global health. And there is a big agenda that calls itself decolonizing global health. And this also applies to global health diplomacy. Much of the literature in diplomacy also says that in the past, diplomats were more representing their countries. Now, with global governance being so important, diplomats have actually become shapers of global governance. They are part of these political processes. And of course, their methods are changing. And, you know, it's not only Donald Trump that is doing foreign policy by Twitter, but many, many other diplomats, ambassadors, foreign affairs organizations are actually using Twitter and other means of social media to bring their message and their positions, their interests to the international stage. So there's a big new mix of secret diplomacy, public diplomacy and negotiation that has emerged, that is also very, very present in the global health sphere and is very different from those gentlemen that you see up there in the cartoon, which was the major powers that came together for the Vienna negotiations, the Vienna Congress, as it was called, to bring peace to Europe. This has a tradition. If we go to the next slide, you will also see a gentleman that most of you will recognize. In 2006, a group of foreign ministers from 7 countries came together, and Célia Amorim, your foreign minister, was part of this undertaking to actually undersign the Oslo Ministerial Declaration, which said global health is a most pressing foreign policy issue of our time, and the need to strengthen the focus of foreign policy. That declaration was absolutely critical. You see on top the then French foreign minister, who interestingly enough also was health minister before. And you can see the initiator, Jonas Støre, who at one point was the chief of staff of Gro Harlem Brundtland when she was Director General of the World Health Organization. So these ministers, together with ministers from other countries like Senegal, for example, South Africa, took this agenda forward and have since presented to the UN General Assembly every year a very important resolution to position health as a goal of foreign policy. If you do go back to this historical document, you will read many of the things that to some extent are coming to the fore now in the COVID-19 crises. Now, while these ministers were trying to push governments, particularly in their foreign policy role, to be much more involved in global health, the next slide shows you that at the same time, the United Nations was aiming to bring other actors to global health diplomacy. They wanted, with the Global Compact, the private sector acting more responsibly. They had an increasing cooperation with global foundations, initially the UN Foundation, later in particular the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and you see Bill Gates on one of these pictures. You also see Jack Ma from China, and you can see that increasingly also the United Nations is working with private actors, and particularly not just the classic type of companies, but actually increasingly important are the big tech actors who are pushing the digital transformation, which is changing our world so much. And one symbol of that is, and it's a big cutoff here in the picture, is that, for example, the very first office, a United Nations office of a big tech company has been opened up in New York. So Microsoft a couple of weeks ago opened an office at the United Nations with an ambassador ambassador in inverted commas, and at the same time sent an ambassador to Brussels because of the negotiations at the European Union in relation to digital regulation. So you can see a new type of diplomacy also developing where the private sector actually mimics the approaches of representation that the classic foreign policy diplomacy has. What has also changed significantly, we can just go very quickly to the next picture, is of course that regional bodies are playing a much stronger role in global health diplomacy, both in terms of how they are acting as alliances within their regions. And of course, Paulo Bus has already alluded to a number of those regional bodies in your region. But we also see that many of them are proactively also creating divisions of global health, are interacting with the WHO and other international organizations. And I will come back to that. This is particularly happening with the European Union and to some extent with the African Union. Next to the regional bodies though, and this is the next slide, the groups that have had the most important role and influence on global health in recent years have been the political clubs. There have been very important declarations and initiatives from the G20, from the G7, the BRICS countries that Brazil, of course, belongs to, have for a while been quite active in their global health discussions. I think this must be picked up again, particularly in context of COVID. And one example here in the center is an organization that many are not so familiar with, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which brings together quite a different grouping of countries. At the same time, particularly if you take the G20 and the G7, they are not able to act as strongly in relation to global health as in the past, because the United States has the presidency of the G7 right now. They are not willing to have the World Health Organization mentioned in any of the declarations, and they have refused to call the coronavirus the coronavirus. They want it called the China or the Wuhan virus. And similar difficulties are faced in negotiations at the G20. The Saudi G20 wanted to work very closely with the WHO and had started that process. But again, it was partly undermined by the approaches of the United States. So the system of diplomacy, I think that was a key message I wanted to give, is very complex, has very many actors. Many people at first instance just say, oh yes, those are negotiations at the WHO. But no, actually some negotiations in other organizations can be, to some extent even more important than at the WHO. And many of you will know that important issues in relation to intellectual property and access to medicines are actually negotiated at the World Trade Organization. And as we speak here, negotiations are going on in relation to an initiative by South Africa and India, 2 BRICS members, who are pushing for ensuring that access to COVID-19 vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics does not fall under any intellectual property restrictions. So very, very important issues. And if one is involved in health diplomacy, one needs to be very, very agile. Are the important issues being discussed at the Human Rights Council? Are they coming up at the UN General Assembly? Are they at WIPO or the World Trade Organization? Are they at the FAO? So health diplomats need to have a very broad view, a very good information system, and of course a good strategy, because to some extent you might launch an issue in one international body, have it discussed there, and then because it has a decision, take it to another international body. You might test things out. You might be able to do one type of alliance in one international body and a different type of alliance in another international body. So these things are very important. And of course, right now we are in global health crisis diplomacy. A fair bit of diplomacy needs to be done at the country level, but all diplomacy right now is really confronted with one of the key players refuting multilateralism. And you can see here a list of the bodies where the United States has either left them, has indicated it would leave them, or has pushed or pressured them. So indicating that multilateral solutions are not a priority for the United States. The United States has indicated it would leave the World Health Organization. It has 1 year to do so. That would be, I believe, the 1st of July next year. It is part of the issue of the US elections. Candidate Biden has said he would take back this decision on the first day of his presidency, because he sees the World Health Organization being absolutely essential for the United States. But at present, we don't know where we are at. And this, of course, this insecurity is difficult. And of course, it has many financial repercussions for the WHO that we might talk about later. If we just move on, every crisis, of course, every crisis, of course, also leads to some changes. I mentioned the regional organizations, and what we see are 2 big movements that are quite important. And one is that the European Union has decided to be a geopolitical actor and to be a global health actor. And we won't have the time right now to go into the many initiatives, also the financial support that has come from the European Union for global health, for vaccines, for many initiatives. But basically, one can say that the European Union helped keep the WHO member states together earlier this year and put forward a resolution, that is the way the WHO works, at the World Health Assembly to reinforce the commitment of the member states to their organization and take this discussion forward. What we can see in terms of political science and international relations, that there's a new move of the middle powers coming together to actually take the agenda forward, because multilateralism is, of course, particularly important to the middle powers, and the smaller countries, the big ones, you know, can move to the back more easily. So without going into great detail, we outlined in the guide that Paulo referred to, and that's on the next slide, the 7 dimensions of global health diplomacy, the way global health diplomacy works. And you can see it's negotiating health and well-being, it's crisis diplomacy, it's contribution to peace and security. It's a lot of alliance building, and it can mean 2 things. It can mean creating better relations between countries because you use health as the entry point. We have found often countries that can't agree on anything else can actually agree on some health issues. So if you find the time, maybe you want to study those 7 dimensions more closely. So you have 7 dimensions, but you also have different levels and functions of organizations within which health diplomacy takes place. So you can see also in terms of the way WHO works, many people only think, you know, of people sitting round on chairs in negotiating rooms, but that of course is not the case. There's a lot of public diplomacy work of WHO. There is the work at the country level. There is work with the regional bodies. It's again, you know, a very complicated interface of diplomacy that's important. So to come to the last part of my presentation, if we look at global health diplomacy, we must also say, you know, what kind of outcomes do we want? So we want better health security and solidarity, and we want better population health, of course. We hope health diplomacy contributes to the relationship between states and brings a wide range of actors together to improve health. And as I mentioned right at the beginning, that these outcomes of global health diplomacy are fair, that they reduce poverty, and that they reduce inequity. And this is really the focus of global health diplomacy right now in the course of the COVID-19. We have a lot of different types of interaction of a diplomatic nature. We've actually created new words. You know, in the past we had ping pong diplomacy or things like that. Now we have vaccine diplomacy, we have mask diplomacy. I wonder, you know, what other diplomacies are going to emerge. But what we have really seen, and the next slide tries to express that, is a very big interface between health diplomacy and science diplomacy. Actually, one of the most important steps that WHO has taken since the outbreak is to bring actors together for research, for development of vaccines, of therapeutics, and of diagnostics. And this new form of international cooperation that's bringing the science community from all across the world together is called the ACT Accelerator. Its most important dimension right now is to fight vaccine nationalism. And it has brought back 2 issues into the global health diplomacy debate. It's reinforced the equity dimension, but also it's reinforced the understanding of health as a global public good, or a common good, as some of the negotiators call it. And you can see that this term of having a people's vaccine is very important. For that, a new alliance has been created, the COVAX, which actually says, vaccines should be a global public good. They have created a new risk-sharing mechanism. And right now, over 180 member states of WHO are part of this. 2 that are not part of it are the United States and Russia. So whereas China has recently joined and China is increasingly offering to share the vaccine it is now developing. But the key negotiation direction right now is to find sufficient resources. The world is looking for $35 billion to ensure an equitable distribution of the vaccine. I've already mentioned what is on the next slide, that a key health diplomacy issue for this global good is the intellectual property issue and the move to request the World Trade Organization to waiver intellectual property. And of course, many of the other players in global health advocacy, like Médecins Sans Frontières, are very, very active to say in such a global crisis, we cannot have patents. And that leads us back to the vaccine nationalism on the one hand that you see on the next slide, but new forms of cooperation that are developing. Of course, your country is one of the partners in this game around the vaccine development, given the fact that China has very few cases with which to test its vaccine. It has an agreement with Brazil and some other countries to actually test the vaccine. So one can see different forms of cooperation emerging and different countries that have a vaccine promising first vaccines to some countries they have special relationships with. We knew this in the Cold War, you side with us, you will get X. So to some extent, that's emerging again. The last 2 points I'll raise next to the vaccine diplomacy and the equitable distribution is that we need to visit the international health regulations. That has a number of very, very important components. It's related to the independence of the WHO in relation to the countries. Can it call out a country? Can it visit a country? Can it, insist that certain measures be taken? And related to that are questions of funding the World Health Organization. And at present, a number of review initiatives are underway to assess also the response of WHO. And one of the key issues for greater independence and authority is, of course, more reliable funding, more assessed contributions. And Germany, as the president of the European Union right now, has started an initiative to increase the assessed contributions of WHO significantly. So let's end. To some extent, all these things are also, in one way or the other, that WHO and global health has dealt with in the past. But this, yes, that slide that was there right now, but this issue that we now need to tackle has been given a new name by the WHO. It's called an infodemic. That takes us to totally new forms of regulation, of data, of information, of false news, of needing to work with the major tech platforms, etc. So this is a new health diplomacy issue. I mentioned diplomats are using these platforms, but the danger that has come with these platforms has not been considered enough, also by global health diplomacy. And there are calls to actually create a new international multilateral agency to deal with these kinds of problems. So I will end by just reinforcing what is the most challenging health diplomacy issue right now. It is geopolitics. For us, it means how will Russia behave? How will China behave? How will the middle powers come together? How will the small parties align themselves, small countries align themselves? And really following the 3rd of November, what will the United States of America do? Thank you very much.
Excelente, muito obrigado, Ilona. Acho que você tocou aí a última
Excellent.
palavra.
Thank you, Ilona. The last word was extremely important. What's going to happen on November 3rd? We here in Latin America are already observing the resurgence of the pink wave. The resurgence of the election in Bolivia showed the resurgence of a progressive government in Bolivia. We hope and expect that the United States, that we have a response by the American people to the situation of denialism led and spearheaded by the president in relation to COVID-19. This has a heavy weight in the American elections, as we all know. Now I have the huge pleasure, Ilona, to turn the floor over to Célia Almeida, our colleague from the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation. Célia is a physician. She has a PhD in public health. It's the Carilion, the bells are ringing at the foundation, chiming 11 a.m. here in Rio. She's a professor at the National School of Public Health. She was the coordinator. She is the coordinator of the master's course in global health and global health diplomacy. She's trained numerous people in the Ministry of Health itself, many researchers and professors here in Brazil, and also students from abroad. We have a graduate studies program, a distance program, and Célia Almeida was the director of the office, regional office of the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation for Africa and Mozambique for several years ago. So I'm citing these references and also mentioning, as I mentioned, concerning Ilona Kickbusch, that Célia has countless articles in major index journals on the theme of global health. And I have the joy and honor of having co-authored with Célia a few articles. And she was the editor in 2010 of an extremely pioneering study and released in a journal here at the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation on global health. And it's a milestone in the debate on global health here in Latin America. So Célia, thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. Obviously, we need you in the seminars, and you have the floor, so take it away. Thank you, Paulo. Thank you indeed for the invitation. And in a sense, I feel also participating in these seminars, paying tribute to José Roberto Ferreira, who their seminars are named for. He's a great friend and a teacher and an interlocutor for decades. It's also a pleasure to hear from Ilona after so long, even though in this remote online, it's a strange way of communicating, but it's great anyway. I have just a little time, so I want to highlight several points which I believe can help us in our debate. Now, I wish to state first that the way that we look at a given issue varies according to the different points of view that we adopt for our reflections and analyses. This doesn't mean that they are divergent or opposing. On the contrary, I think they're always complementary. After this overview and panorama that Ilona has shown us, I'm going to dwell more on highlighting a few points which I consider essential for these reflections. I think that there's no doubt whatsoever that global health diplomacy or health diplomacy is more necessary than ever, now more than ever, especially in this extremely difficult conjuncture that we're experiencing now with the pandemic. But it's precisely for that reason that I need to understand the terrain that we're trotting. In several authors' opinions, whom I agree with, health diplomacy or global health diplomacy should be analyzed, taking into consideration the global context and the conjuncture in which it plays out and acts. I believe that Ilona has already brought us key elements for this, but I would like to go into some depth on a few issues from this perspective. The first point that I wish to highlight refers to the importance of the debates on multilateralism and the dynamic of the interstate system, which consists of the nation states. And the world is very heterogeneous, characterized by major asymmetries of power and led by hegemonic powers, which change over the course of centuries, but without changing the mechanisms of strengthening in addition to these powers that are proper to capitalism. In other words, economic competition, accumulation of wealth, and disputes for territory. In multilateral relations, the UN, the Bretton Woods systems has been cited. We've created the post-war to give a way determine social order, economic order, and also sector order. This dynamic includes the world order can be defined based on the institutional characteristics, the normative institutional characters in circumstances of cooperation, competition, and conflict on a large scale in the interstate system. It was structured in different historical moments, consolidating capitalist accumulation based on different waves of globalization. And the interstate system, because its very nature, is ruled by two contradictory forces. The first is the trend towards building an empire or universal state, which usually has no interest in collaboration and is imposed over the other nation states. The second is the resistance or refusal by the other states to accept impositions which threaten its sovereignty, hence their sovereignty. This long historical process was marked by wars, changes in hegemony and revolutions, and other movements which that are translational recently. Multilateralism from the classic liberal perspective can be understood as an articulation of 3 or more countries around some objective of common interest to them, which assumes institutional mechanisms for coordination, interaction, and established according to certain principles and standards of conduct independently of the plurality of interests of the parts involved, the stakeholders, or the requirements, strategic requirements, which may or may not result in international policies to be followed by everyone. However, multilateralism and the world order are interrelated, i.e., multilateralism is an active force and cannot be unlinked from the historical process in which it occurs, or the context, i.e., the context which shapes the structure of the world order. And to understand the potential for change in multilateralism, it's necessary to analyze it from a perspective of power relations which move the interstate system. In other words, the term multilateral incorporates 2 meanings, one related to relations between states and the other relations between various different stakeholders, public, private, civil society, mediated by the states and by international organizations. The specific context of the emergence of multilateralism, contemporary sense, dates back to the negotiations of the post-war period and has at least 2 different dimensions, the economic dimension and the political dimension. The changes in direction of the world order and consequently of multilateralism were deep and significant. In very brief terms, the structure of the liberal world order was shaped in the post-war negotiations led by the United States under its command, including multilateralism as the dynamic motor force of a dynamic which rebuilt the countries that were devastated by the Second World War, promoting development like its leader, and maintained an interstate system, a dynamic one and cooperative interstate system around common objectives. In the economic objective, this provisional consensus launched the basis for the expansion of world capitalism. In the political dimension, and the institutionalized the necessary arrangements for this with a multilateral system. The progress would be leveraged without the need for conflicts combining different stakeholders whose relations would be mediated by the nation states and the international organizations. The growth of the states in economic, scientific, technological spheres funded, paradoxically, the expansion of welfare states in Europe and emerged in this period in Europe and continued to grow during the 1970s, including the modernization of the health systems like the United States. In other words, centered on hospital-centered permanent inclusion of state-of-the-art technologies, pharmaceutical and laboratory inputs, and its crisis, which began in the late 1970s. There was also, as part of this process, the increasing concentration and production of inputs, health inputs, and by multinational companies in the first stage, and transnational and deterritorialized companies afterwards. This form of organization of health services spread across the world, stimulated by reforms, the decrease in state provision of services, increase in the share by the private sector, targeting on the poorest with basic packages and evaluation of the market for the solution to the health problems. The economic crises and the end of bipolarity altered the leadership of the world order after the post-Cold War in the 1990s, evidencing unilateral strategies, extremely bellicose and interventionist, using imperial power from the United States. Concurrently, the economic and political ideals of the neoliberal system, which was ruled out in the immediate post-war period, reclaimed its leadership and protagonism under the leadership of the IMF, the World Bank, and a set of different stakeholders and strengths, institutionalized forces, and capable of influencing structural changes in the world capitalist order, and which are supported on state power, although backed by through networks of relations, had grown extensively, intervening significantly in global governance and health governance in the late 20th century. Consequently, this change in the conduction of the world order and in power relations between different stakeholders also affected the multilateral dynamics in the interstate system, promoting resistance and other reactions by other states, increasingly frequent. In short, the disappearance of the bipolar geopolitical regime, the ethical and ideological foundations that backed cooperation between the major capitalist powers also disappeared, evidencing that it was about a time of transition to a uncertain world order. An important issue occurred in the second decade of the 21st century, more precisely in 2017, with the United States formulating its new foreign policy and abandoning any commitment to lead a world order that was favorable to the interstate system and the promotion of development in the world, making explicit the defense of its own national interests at any cost. America first. The old geopolitics was the compass of the world order. Economic nationalism was practiced again by the major powers, and the major objectives, humanitarian objectives of the 1990s, were relegated to the second stage of the international agenda. Hence, the hegemonic power of the United States challenge and boycotts any attempt at a multilateral, any bloc or institution which represents or is backed by multilateralism. With this new change, we're sacrificing multilateralism, but a deepened crisis of legitimacy and efficacy for the multilateral organizations. The second point which I wish to highlight here relates to the multilateral organizations of the multilateral system per se, which includes the WHO. These organizations are not mere formal organizations or static organizations made of member states organized around a set of standards, rules, guidelines, and procedures, but they are social spaces for policies, for clashes, confrontations, negotiations, which reflect this broader dynamic of multilateralism in the world order. In other words, they are arenas where the stakeholders and the actors orient their actions in relation to the other actors. As a social and political space, an institutionalized space, there's a shared system for rules and procedures which define who the actors are, what they are, their roles, and what kind of acts are possible and actions are possible, suggesting several different multilateral organizations, transnationals, formulating new global policies involving states and governmental and non-governmental organizations, in addition to numerous lobbying groups or pressure groups. The United Nations is a center for a new system which has simultaneously altered the legal framework within which the states operated. It leveraged economic change for some 30 years. The UN, a very short period of time, from 1945 to 1975. This web of relations allowed direct dialogue between world powers, and it allowed the inclusion of the capitalist periphery in the multilateral decision-making processes, but it also incorporated in its modus operandi the privileged position of the most powerful actors, and ever since 1945. In other words, the new power relations reproduce the historical asymmetries both between states and between actors in different states. Nevertheless, in addition to the mechanisms by which the world power is exercised, overcomes interstate relations by the proliferation of actors that act in international arenas and in national arenas. And what's more evident still in the post-Cold War, since 1990, although the nation states continue to be a crucial part in the multilateral system, they've maintained relations between other actors as well. And the mechanisms that use all these levels among the decision-making process at the global level and the implementation at the national and local levels, and vice versa as well, the effects of local actions at the global level as well. The new institutional arrangements and intergovernmental networks or transgovernmental networks act in parallel to the multilateral organizations, and actors that are purely private have created their own institutions encompassing all the way from government deregulation to arbitration courts. Some of these arbitration courts and some of these mechanisms have an influence, a greater influence than the states themselves. For example, the financial markets, the standards of the private sector, and the principle for lobbies and so forth. In this complex interdependence, the global problems that are shared ensure that multilateralism can shape but not eliminate the power asymmetries. The third point I'm going to try to skim because of our time limit refers to diplomacy per se, and it also has changed importantly during this process. And it's the entry in the health issues on the foreign policy agendas of the nation states. And here I would say very briefly that diplomacy is generally seen as a tool of foreign policy, a profession that requires specialized training and so forth, and like other professions as well. But diplomacy per se has not received sufficient attention. It has not been the object of discussion, a more in-depth discussion, because there's a clear separation between practical activity, i.e. the methods of diplomacy, for example, negotiation and critical reflection on it. And health itself is not a prime concern of international relations. And recently, some actors have begun to discuss diplomacy as an institution. And here, I would say parenthetically, an organization, institution, they're different. An organization assumes formal bureaucratic structures, physical headquarters and so forth, but institutions are oriented more towards processes. They can be permanent, connected by a set of conceptual standards and definitions, and have behaviors and restrictions in addition to shaping expectations. The classic example is the G7, G20, etc. Therefore, diplomacy is also a social practice, integrated and incorporated into the global political space, and it's co-constituent of this space, co-constituent, contributing to its differentiation and reproduction. As was mentioned previously, it changed also a lot, although it is a 1,000-year-old practice. It also changed over the course of the centuries, and it became a crucial element in times of change, complex and interdependent, interconnected changes, and savage globalization propelling inequalities and iniquities. Hence, also action by diplomats also changed considerably over the decades and centuries. They're forced to face and confront different decision-making processes in different fields, but not all of the topics merit the same attention from them, from the diplomats. And even health issues themselves oftentimes are not considered prone or solvable by diplomatic solutions, for example. And a classic example is the strengthening of health systems, for example. Therefore, the question that emerges from this discussion is, what is a diplomat, especially in the 21st century, since they confront a set of relations which involve not only organizations and institutions, various different ones, but different individuals with global interests. There's not a single answer to this question, what is a diplomat? But the actors emphasize that a 21st century diplomat should be able to confront complex interactions where different traditional diplomatic practices coexist. She called it the club diplomacy, other ones that include world changes called network diplomacy, club diplomacy, network diplomacy. The fourth point that I wish to highlight, obviously this has an impact, and it is a permanent effort at reconciling different ideas and political desires limited by the dictates of the circumstances. Now, by definition, diplomats are professionals who represent the interests of their respective countries. However, as a social practice, it can be exercised by different actors from different ways, and it may or may not be coordinated by diplomats per se. This does not mean that their acts are truly effective if they overlook foreign policy in their respective countries, or if there is not some political backing of their respective nation states. Finally, fourth point that I wish to emphasize is the issue of the entry of the health issue into the foreign policy agendas and the emergence itself of health diplomacy. Somebody has already mentioned here, and Ilona has already mentioned several different of these problems and the challenges that are called global health has to face, based on the interconnectivity and interdependence amongst the countries, but these circumstances do not produce alone a harmony of interests between states to be engaged in effective collective actions. Therefore, vis-a-vis the term, I would say that one can infer that it has two dimensions. One dimension refers to the relationship between health and foreign policy, which differs considerably among countries. It's not static or permanent, and it can change over the years, over time. And we here in Brazil are experiencing this painfully. So in the relationship of diplomacy itself as a social practice, co-constituent of the political space, global political space, and increasingly it intervenes and impacts this dynamic, impacts global governance and health sector governance as well, demonstrating and evidencing a scenario, a highly complex and complicated scenario, because increasingly the most powerful actors are preponderant in the global health governance. But in periods of crisis, in the broader sense of the word, they impact adversely the foreign policies of the countries, consequently in the international arena. And this is what we are experiencing now, today. In my opinion, what we have achieved, and I say we, because I believe that we are part of this group, the arena of governance and global health. Global health diplomacy was led by the community, professional community, political and professional people, professionals from global health field, the national level, starting with the promoting interrelations with foreign policy, cooperative projects, and in the international arena, based on greater participation in the political spaces, global political spaces. By way of conclusion, in times of epidemics and pandemics in recent decades, especially the one we're living in now, which require immediate and mediating action by international organizations, especially the WHO, but not only the WHO, in a global scenario with no order, with major political polarizations, stressed and tension by conflicts under media scrutiny. What would be the role and action by global health diplomacy? The feeling of vulnerability, the health systems, especially in these cases, cannot be separated from the political feeling of social vulnerability. In other words, the risk is not independent but socially built, and it's part of a political process where values and interests shape the results. And the way that we respond to risks is socially mediated, where multiple factors, underlying factors, are not amenable to control, resulting in permanent uncertainty and vulnerability. Therefore, in contemporary societies, which are extremely interdependent, the risks are unpredictable, unavoidable, and catastrophic, practically incalculable, and consisting always of exorbitant challenges. And we're experiencing this very clearly in this pandemic, where the multiple crises which already existed and were already happening before, not only gain greater visibility, and they're also juxtaposed and overlapping in the same political conjuncture. Also, one cannot fail to mention that the growing limitations that austerity policy have imposed and continue to impose on the nation states, both in economy and social policies, or failed to distinction between private and public ethics, are also elements of great importance in this process. Hence, the preparation for confronting risks find no material and social basis for the anchor themselves, and they are don't materialize. Therefore, neither does the interstate cooperation materialize. The disputes between states for essential goods for security in this pandemic. New piracy proliferate unbridled, and xenophobia and the lack of coordination of actions between countries and within the same country. And Brazil is a prime example of that, a clear example. All this requires and resistance to, and the physical, social distancing, lockdown, mask wearing, and so forth. All this requires reliable leadership. It's a rare product in the market today. Reliable leadership and social cohesion, solidarity, and empathy, which have been devalued by consumerist individualism, neoliberal individualism, and the ultra-right, which has taken power in many countries at the global level in all regions of the world. The far right. All this evidence is that the undermining of the multilateral system has resulted in a dual dynamic by assuming and incorporating the principles of the new neoliberal world order, as for example, public-private partnerships, initiatives, public-private initiatives, and I'm not here criticizing directly, but without regulation, actual regulation, which can transform the work of these partnerships into public goods, actual public goods in the real world. It's a problem which undermines internally the multilateral system and jeopardizes the action by organizations vis-a-vis the contemporary challenges, simultaneously internalizing the problems coming from this choice, and is hostage to powers who have their own interests in parallel to this. The external pressure has intensified with changes in the world order, as mentioned before. Vis-a-vis the spin-offs, the devastating spin-offs of the epidemic in the history of mankind. The worst one, only because of the specificity of the pathogen, because of these simultaneous crises. Hence, with these demarcations, which are contextualized, how can we promote so needed global health diplomacy? I think that this is a challenge. It's something which challenges us to reflect. The dilemmas are on the table, and the outcome of this process is still undetermined. Therefore, it's in our hands as well. Thank you, Célia. We are rather far along in our schedule. I'd like to recommend that people who wish to ask questions, please read the article that you published with Rodrigo, which is in Cielo. It's a preprint in the Cielo database, so I suggest reading your article. We can upload it on the site. Reference this article, this fascinating article where you address different parts of your article, what you addressed today in your talk. Thank you very much. You discussed issues which have been raised for you. Afterwards, we'll discuss them. Santiago Alcázar. Now let's turn the floor over to him, to a diplomat. He's a career diplomat, as I said. He was the ambassador to Azerbaijan, before that in Burkina Faso. He was co-author of the meeting which led to the Oslo Ministerial Declarations on Foreign Policy and Health, and was part of Celso Amorim's team, and I know very well how much he participated in that declaration. Afterwards, as for a long period, he was our coordinator of IEs at the area, of International Affairs and Health. So Santiago has the floor. I don't need to say how happy we are to hear you with this vision of a diplomat in the field of global health and global health diplomacy.
Paulo.
Thank you very much, Paulo. First of all, I wish to congratulate both speakers, Professor Ilona Kickbusch. She gave us a panorama, and Célia gave us a more microscopic view, so I feel free to not have to repeat the same issues that they have already addressed so brilliantly, these two renowned professors. I actually want to focus on just one point, which called and caught my attention in the book on global health by Ilona and co-authors on global health diplomacy. And this point, which I highlight, is the role of diplomats, the changing role of diplomats. An example that I chose from the book to illustrate this was the negotiating process that resulted in the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, the so-called SDGs. This process, in a rather imprecise way, and perhaps an impressionist way, the diplomat's role changed from that of a guardian, the guardian that controls all the official contacts at the international level, to a role of coordinator and facilitator, the whole of government and whole of society approach. In other words, emphasizing these expression, whole of government and whole of society approach. Excellent term in English. In the middle of the road, the diplomat realizes that in addition to defending his or her country's interests, the diplomats also had to defend the interests of the global community. A modern diplomat thus wears two hats, so to speak. And that's the point that I want to explore briefly here. One, I should clarify that this juxtaposition of roles is something new. I should say from the onset, it's been imposed by the growing awareness that our acts are not without consequences. This is extremely important. As in chaos theory, implementation of harmful environmental policies in one country contribute to the planet's climate change. They cause desertification, crisis of the water supply, worse quality of air, migratory movements, widespread human rights violations, outbreaks of infectious diseases with pandemic potential, and so forth. All of this is connected to it's a cosmovision, perhaps an abstract vision. We are all connected, and that's the awareness of a historical fact. COVID-19 has taught us that no one is safe until everyone is safe. Gone are the days when each person could act as owners that owe nothing to anyone, and they do what they feel like on their own property. Our acts have consequences and can produce risks and threats to others. As Ilona recalled so appropriately in 2006, the foreign ministers of Africa, South Africa, Brazil, France, Indonesia, Norway, Senegal, and Thailand adopted the famous Oslo Ministerial Declaration entitled Global Health, a pressing foreign policy issue of our time. Central to the ministerial declaration, it's central because we're talking about foreign affairs ministers and not health ministers. What's essential to the declaration is the recognition that threats to health can compromise the security and stability of these countries. Security and stability systems are normally laid out by the United Nations Security Council, the fact that the foreign affairs ministers say in this declaration that health can jeopardize security and stability in the countries was something new, truly noteworthy. Until then, until the Oslo Declaration, the issues passed over health issues. The recognition that health can influence them is an important stride in awareness of that issues have a global impact. The declaration establishes the commitment to have the impact on health be the point of departure in the lens for examining development policies and strategies. This is increasingly, every time I reread this part of the declaration, I realize that how revolutionary it is, revolutionary in the sense of implementing something new. It's so important, this declaration, that since 2008, or in other words, 12 years, the UN General Assembly has included on its agenda the IBL global health and foreign policy. Just to give you an idea of the importance of the impact of this declaration on the United Nations and the multilateral world, and since 2015, in other words, 5 years, the various different resolutions on that item also include a reference to the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. And I can say to you that this is no small matter. 2030 agenda is a turning point. The document adopted by the 70th session of the UN General Assembly focuses on its central point, the severity for the people and the planet, and efforts to ensure dignity for all human beings. This here is not just any old document. This can be found amongst the multiple documents of the United Nations. Many people would say that it's not perfect. And a few days ago, I realized that there was an intention to reopen it to include and emphasize other important points, perhaps that were not included at the time. That may be, it may not be perfect. It may be necessary to reopen this document to include other points. But the actual fact is that there is no other document with such widespread acceptance to serve as the guidance for sustainable development, which, by the way, is also part of global health diplomacy. Health, human rights, environment, and the economy intertwine with very deep interconnections. Again, everything is connected. And you may ask what all this has to do with the changing role of the diplomat, and what relevance can this have? Okay, fine. The 2030 agenda, the Oslo Declaration, and the various different resolutions on global health and foreign policy, and the Paris Accord on climate change, just to cite these few examples, demand a radical change of perspective for diplomats. It's no longer possible, based on the document adoption of these instruments, to pick the topics under a favorable light. In other words, cherry picking, in this wonderful expression from English, picking the best charities they want. Based on the adoption of those instruments, a diplomat has to take into consideration the entire forest or the orchard, and not just a few trees, without losing sight of the butterfly effect of chaos theory for human beings on the planet. Everything is connected. And the only place where humans can do this is in the United Nations, which has to be revalued and reinforced and re-strengthened. It's in the United Nations that the fate of humankind will be decided. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought us an opportunity to have an awareness, not only that everything is connected, but that all of us are connected. Some would say that we already knew that we were interconnected through social networks and the internet. Now, this has shown us something deeper. The mantra that has been repeated, and no one is safe until everyone is safe, highlights the principle underlying the 2030 agenda. Leave no one behind. Emphasizing that again in English, leave no one behind. Materializing the votes for unity and solidarity, which are essential for confronting the pandemic. In English, there's a difference between the personal pronoun we and the object pronoun us. In Portuguese, we use nós for we and nos for us. It's kind of confusing, I confess, but in times of pandemic, what isn't confusing in the pandemic? What I mean to say is that the radical change in perspective that diplomats are now forced to adopt because of the global issues like health, environment, and human rights means that they'll have to use more often we, because there's no more room for us. In our age, we need more we, and what's more universal and inclusive than us, which is parochial and non-inclusive. I should say that I owe this subtlety of language and the English language to my cousin who lives in the United Kingdom. It's extremely important. This distinction between we and us might be worthwhile to examine under the lens of we and us. The speeches delivered during the celebration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and as well as those addressed delivered the following day in a debate which launched the 75th session of the United Nations Assembly to measure the actual determination for unity facing the greatest health crisis in our recent history. There's a lot of us and little we in the information and the advanced purchases of COVID-19 vaccines by just a handful of countries. No matter how much goodwill the new diplomat has with a holistic vision on issues of a global nature, it's necessary to consider the evolution of a consciousness as well as the evolution of the species does not occur once and for all. There's always some lag or delay. The nickel doesn't drop at the same time for everybody. There's our resistances that need to be taken into consideration. What calls our attention here is the United Nations has 9 different treaties on human rights and 1 optional protocol, and that the ILO has 189 different treaties and conventions. One could assume that having been declared, human rights will be understood in an integrated and universal way, and as well, just as labor rights. It's surprising that it's necessary to have so many different instruments and conventions to express what would appear obvious to an alien who might visit us from outer space. It would appear that human rights and labor rights are like Lego parts that have to be put together one at a time to form a whole. The kind of construction may never end, like Antonio Gaudi's Holy Family, which is interminable and in its first conception, rights which are not universally acknowledged because there's always an us to get in the way. Rights that have to be reclaimed, reconquered day by day, moment by moment, because in their essence, us is just us, incapable of developing and projecting itself in the we. The diplomats of us could claim that we're living in a world of watertight compartments. In other words, the reality today is different. Everything is connected, and we are all connected. Global health diplomacy is a reality that's imposed, as well as environmental diplomacy and human rights diplomacy. And the quest for a new normal, which that's what it's all about. We have to ensure that the new normal that we are seeking and that has brought us here today will no longer be this normal that we need. What we need is to dare to think outside of orthodoxy without failing to take into consideration the possibility that the new normal will be orthogonal to orthodoxy itself, always situated at the center of humans and the planet. These were my brief words, but first I wish to say to Ilona and Célia, say how important it is, the importance that I see in including women in this fine art of diplomacy. They are absolutely right that it's an art that's been dominated for centuries by men, and perhaps we have not achieved all the success that we could have achieved if we had opened the doors to give another dimension, women's dimension, because it's necessary to consider that diplomacy has to no longer be an exercise behind closed doors and open up to other people, other segments of society, and that this may be a deep democratic exercise for us to be able to actually properly mirror the reality that surrounds us. And with these words, I'll conclude now my remarks. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Santiago. As I said, to our audience, we would have today good surprises with participation, interesting participation in issues. Santiago has brought us this vision and appeals to a renewed vision of diplomacy, for diplomacy, which has great traditions, but I believe that he's raised a dimension to be analyzed, because in this intersection between health and diplomacy, through health diplomacy, I believe that this contribution by Santiago Alcázar on the vision of the role, the changing role, and interventions and possibilities for interventions by diplomats is extremely relevant and interesting. There are numerous questions here for you, and we have 158 people attending, 97 in Portuguese and 61 people in English. Therefore, we have a lot of people from outside of Brazil attending, apparently 19 different countries. So we have a very broad and representative audience. So I want to have one question for Ilona Kickbusch and turn it over to Luis, because he's going to address questions to Ilona, to Célia, and Santiago. For Ilona, I would like to leave a question of my own, and Luis can formulate the questions from the other people he's selected and combine some questions, and then I'll turn it over to you. Ilona, it's the following. How are you announcing, Ilona, revision by the WHO, the response by the WHO to a revision to the pandemic? It's a group, an independent group, which is going to be doing an inventory of the WHO. It's not just a proposal by the United States. They had this ridiculous role of abandoning the WHO and this scandal by Mr. Trump, but it's actually a proposal by the European Union. And so I'd like to hear your opinion. You, in a sense, have you already done this? Have you already left in your presentation? You already gave us an idea that we had by the WHO, but how would you imagine what you would imagine, which will be the possible reforms or changes that the pandemic, as was treated by the WHO, will bring on the part of these commissions and the General Assembly as well on the reform of the WHO, which would be necessary vis-a-vis the response by the WHO to the pandemic? I'll leave this question for you already. And Louise, I'll turn the floor over to you to coordinate the questions from our remote audience for the three speakers, having each of them addressing one question for each speaker. Thank you, Paulo. So the first question that we received is addressed to Ilona and by Ulysses Panesse. Ulysses, based on a quote of an article by Catherine Osborne in July 2020 called "Bolsonaro Made Brazil a Pandemic Pariah." Ulysses asks, Brazil, Ilona, is Brazil losing missing an opportunity to cooperate globally? The second question by Rodrigo Campos, it's for Professor Célia, is asked, to what extent can we use this historic and conceptual framework that you presented to address and analyze the situation of the response to the COVID-19? And a third question, which has reached us by Duvalli, it's for Santiago Alcázar. He would like to know how we could analyze the geopolitical dispute, both at the international and national levels, involving the vaccine and the issue of patents. And we'll turn the floor over to the three speakers. Ilona, you have the floor to comment on the two questions that were raised for you.
Yes, thank you very much, Paulo. Your question first. We really have a situation right now where the European Union is, first of all, trying to get a consensus within the European Union as to the reforms of WHO, whereas the starting point of discussing reforms is not the starting point the US had. The starting point was to say there are things that have not functioned, and we need to understand why they have not functioned, and we know why some of them haven't functioned. They haven't functioned because WHO doesn't have enough authority, because the international health regulations do not give the WHO that authority. They have not functioned because WHO is not financed significantly. They haven't functioned because some of the governing bodies don't function in the way that they should. And they haven't functioned because one needs perhaps some additional instruments that are necessary. And just like during the preparation of the World Health Assembly resolution, the European Union has been reaching out, particularly in Geneva, but also beyond that, to many, many of the other member states. I think, and that relates to something Santiago said, in these negotiations about WHO, the European Union is trying to show that global responsibility. It's not, trying to say, okay, the US is leaving, we're the new kids on the block, we're going to tell you where you have to go to. So it's a very complex negotiation because, as Célia said, there is fears of losing sovereignty from the side of the countries for very different reasons. Big, powerful countries have other reasons for not wanting their sovereignty impinged than small island states. And whereas one must say some small island states very often have very little choice about having their sovereignty impinged, and Célia has, shown the power mechanisms that are at play. But I must say, and here I speak as a European, we are happy that the European Union is trying to be a more responsible actor in multilateralism. As a German, I'm happy that Germany has initiated with France an alliance on multilateralism, which works in New York very, very strongly, trying to bring the middle powers together. And Germany, with the presidency of the European Union, has just issued a new global health strategy that speaks of the kinds of global responsibilities that Santiago has highlighted and is trying to move things forward. So many of the, for people who've been in global health for longer, many of the suggestions that you find on this list of the European Union and other countries like Australia, etc., they're nothing new for us. And, we have been very frustrated, and many countries that were fighting for these kinds of reforms, particularly countries from the global south, want something to happen now. And so maybe there is, what some political scientists call a cosmopolitan moment. Often in crises, something happens. And we only got the international health regulations because of the SARS crises, for example. Santiago will remember that very well. So the question now is, how can a coalition of countries, and particularly of the Global South and the strong countries in the Global South, I was mentioning South Africa and India, actually help move that forward? And that leads to the other question about Brazil. Of course, Santiago will remember the days when Brazil was one of the most important countries in global health diplomacy. It set agendas. We would not have a framework convention on tobacco control if it had not been for Brazil. Let's be very, very clear about that. And so therefore, I think, we who sort of move around in this Geneva bubble, as some people call it, we have been very sad that, this strong human rights oriented voice of Brazil, that equity oriented voice of Brazil, Brazil's voice in including non-governmental actors, the social actors in the debate, that has weakened. And of course, it's weakened not only in the WHO. You know that the Brazilian head of the World Trade Organization resigned before his position came to an end. So in answer to Ulysses' question, in a way, we say, we global health people say, we really miss Brazil. And we wish they would come back as the kind of actor that they were in Santiago's days. We really, really wish that. And we will see what happens. And it's similar with the United States. Of course, as Célia said, the United States is, in a sense, a superpower. Of course, it's pushed WHO in directions that one didn't always want. But it was committed to multilateralism. And the whole scientific expertise of the United States was available for WHO. And there was a consensus. We want to fight things out in this arena, in the social space Célia mentioned. And at present, we don't have a common agreement even on the social space. And I think, that is a really, really worrying thing for the multilateralism that Santiago has spoken about and for the future of our world.
Célia, por favor.
Obrigado.
Obrigado, Ilona.
Thank you, Ilona. Thank you, Ilona. Célia, you have the floor.
Eu penso que
I believe, and in Brazil, actually, I don't know if it would be to you historically or conceptually properly, but it's quite clear to us that until the 2016 coup, not only Brazilian diplomacy, the diplomatic corps was highly respected globally, both because of the quality of its action and so forth, and starting rather than as compared to the 1990s, but with more intensity, starting in the 2000s, in the first decades of the 2000s, the 21st century, we achieved and conquered a new position
no sistema interestatal,
in the interstate system,
uma posição
a position of more respect and one of being able to be heard, and including the entry of health on the foreign policy agenda. It was quite clear and assumed, taken over explicitly, and this taken on explicitly. This allowed us to move forward on various different themes. Some of them have come back again, and they're on the table again in the worst possible way, as, for example, the issue of intellectual property rights. Just to cite one example, which is now on the table, and what we experienced starting, in other words, I'm not going to list a laundry list of all our different gains in this process, but there were numerous gains, and after that, we've experienced not only backpedaling in this process, we are experiencing a veritable destruction of everything that was built, for example, with regard to the positions, Brazil's position in relation to the United States. Obviously, a change, radical change, where the current foreign policy or the current government administration has a subordinate, subservient position, absolutely inconceivable for a country that at least respects us the least bit, and especially a ruler who respects his own people. So something has always happened in the history of foreign policy in Brazil is this bond with the hegemonic power. We cannot deny this. It never has, but there are important turning points in, especially in the late 1990s and the first decade until mid about 2014 in our foreign policy, where there was truly an attempt at diversifying our alliances and participation in the global debates, both in international forums and also in the regional organizations in Latin America and the Caribbean, and also in the Portuguese-speaking African countries, which also allowed us action in the health field, which is extremely, I would say, extremely important. I had the privilege of participating very close, firsthand, this process during the period under the coordination of Fiocruz in Africa. And I learned a lot in this process of interacting with the other countries from a perspective, a quite different perspective, or at least attempting for it to be in terms of cooperation, vertical cooperation. Cooperation that's normally done, and ever since the international cooperation for development and foreign aid in the post-war period, which has never been concerned greatly with strengthening either the local health systems or the structures that can sustain the health systems over time. So, from this perspective, I believe that the COVID pandemic has actually laid bare clearly what saddens me, that it's not clear to the Brazilian population because of many other variables, but it has laid bare and made very clear this backpedaling to the point of our Minister of Foreign Relations is a joke, an international joke, not to mention our president. They're international jokes. Ulysses mentioned an article by Catherine Osborne, whom I know, but there are other that are much worse, other international statements that make this very clear. And this, for us, I don't know, for all Brazilians, I repeat, who participated in another process, this is extremely painful. And I'm going just to make a brief announcement here, an advertisement. We are finalizing a project now, a multi-center project on health and foreign policy. In other words, health in foreign policy agendas or global health diplomacy in countries of the Americas, Canada, and 3 in the South, Mexico, Chile, and Brazil. And the first article, the comparative article, it's been a very, dates to 2016. It's been a rich development in collaboration with Ottawa, Almeida and Ami Hoka, who were cited by Ilona. And it's been a very fruitful collaboration. The first article, the comparative article, is in press, where we propose a first attempt, an approach to a conceptual framework to discuss health diplomacy. Other articles will come after this first one, although the first one is more conceptual. It already points to several of the issues that I raised, the differences between countries, the elements and the variables that intervene in each country and so forth. And I'm proud to say that Brazil has an important position in this comparison. So thank you very much. Thank you, Célia. Santiago, there's a question. You already have your question on the table, and we'll adjourn in just a few minutes. Thank you, Paulo. So 2 points. I said that the nickel hasn't dropped for everybody. When we were talking about pandemics, it doesn't do any good for us to have vaccines for some and no vaccines for others. So that's the first point. Caught my attention when some countries purchased virtually the entire inventory. It's still going to be produced. This is absurd with regard to the intellectual property system, especially the TRIPS agreement and Doha, which are two the essential instruments for this. TRIPS and Doha. Apparently there is major difficulty even in mentioning them in the United Nations. And they've adopted 2 resolutions in May, if I'm not mistaken. And neither of the 2 resolutions even mentions the intellectual property regime, which is basic for ensuring relevant products, health products for COVID. The cost embedded with the intellectual property. The same thing with the WHO, the resolution, the only resolution which was approved there. It's not a FASTIC source, a reference for leaving the intellectual property regime, at least flexibilized for these products. I have the impression that I know that we're experiencing a world with 3 dimensions, spatial and time, 3 spatial dimensions plus time. This is part of Einstein's theory, but there are other dimensions in which we're immersed now. It's a reality. It's a parallel reality, so to speak, living in this pandemic. And 5th dimension, this is rather shocking because everything that we used to think that we knew served absolutely no purpose. We're in a conceptual revolution where nothing is true, nothing is a lie. And it's somewhat difficult to get your bearings. I don't know if I answered the question, but I think that was the basis. Thank you very much, Santiago. Unfortunately, we are reaching the end of our seminar. But as the old tradition said, the show must go on. So I already invite you 3 to the next edition of the debate on health diplomacy, which will be when we are launching the Brazilian edition of your book in Portuguese. And I hope that you would accept the invitation to return to the advanced seminars of our global health centers at Fiocruz. Célia and Santiago are also invited because we want to discuss more on global health diplomacy. A great audience has participated here from Brazil and abroad, 19 countries. I want to thank everybody. I also want to thank the translator, Christopher Peterson, who is great. He does good work. I want to thank the Abrasco group and the technical staff of the Fiocruz Global Health Center with this remote tool. And I want to announce that next week. Ilona, you should know this. They're going to be holding virtually the Latin American Congress in Global Health, organized by the Latin American Alliance for Global Health, 12 organizations from Mexico to Argentina, with Colombia, Brazil, and other countries. And this Congress begins at 12 on the 28th, 12, which is a Wednesday. Brasilia time. The keynote lecture will be a session as well, 12 noon on the 28th. We're going to take advantage of the keynote session as another seminar. In this seminar will be entitled The Health and Political and Social Dimensions and Economic Dimensions of the COVID-19 Pandemic in Latin America. And we are going to have as speakers Dr. Jarbas Barbosa, who is the Vice Deputy Director of the Pan American Health Organization, a Brazilian, Jarbas Barbosa. And we're also going to have in this debate Simone Cicchini, the economist, who's the director of the Department of Social Development at ECLAC or CIPAL, ECLAC/CIPAL, Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean of the United Nations, CIPAL/ECLAC, the long-standing tradition. Simon actually is an economist. Both of them are going to be having a great debate on the health issue, the political, social, economic issue, and obviously the issue of health diplomacy. So you're all invited and to discuss how the countries are confronting the epidemic, and the Congress will continue afterwards with other events later on the 28th and 29th. And also I want to announce, take advantage of this large audience that we still have today, that and the following week on November 3rd, we're going to have a fascinating discussion, which is on the Fratelli Tutti, the papal bull, in other words, social message by the Pope, Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis, state which is represented in the United Nations, the Holy See, the Vatican. It's going to be discussed by Leonardo Boff, Cecilia Benayo, and the president of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences, Professor Luis Davidovich. This to avoid being interpreted as Catholic propaganda. It's not. The leadership, political leadership called on by Pope Francis, which is the leader of the Holy See. The Vatican is a state which has a seat in the United Nations. So we're discussing Fratelli Tutti with Laudato Si, which is extremely important messages, these papal bulls. And I want to announce that we're waiting with bated breath that the Pope can send us a message to inaugurate this seminar. We've asked the Vatican to send us a message. We hope that Pope Francis, who's an Argentine, but loves Brazil nevertheless, despite the brotherly rivalry, is a Brazilian by heart. He gave a beautiful declaration yesterday concerning the rights of civil union between people of the same sex. Homo-affective unions. So we're broadcasting this message by Pope Francis, discussing in advanced seminars on the 3rd of November. Finally, we also wish to announce that we are in discussions, preliminary discussions with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations, Dr. Michelle Bachelet, for in December. Dr. Bachelet will give us an inventory of human rights issues at the global level in an advanced seminar in December. We've had a meeting with Dr. Bachelet, Michelle Bachelet, an hour-long meeting. Was it day before yesterday, Santiago? Monday, we had a meeting with Dr. Michelle Bachelet to discuss with her to determine how we could have a movement for equity, sustainable equity in health, and related to the Human Rights Council. And Dr. Michelle Bachelet was extremely open and we're calling on the Latin American charismatic leader to be the keynote speaker in the closing session of the advanced seminars in global health diplomacy, CRIS and Fiocruz, José Roberto Ferreira. Ilona, a big kiss for you. Thank you. You're always brilliant and instigating, and you're a friend of Brazil and Fiocruz. We count on you to continue in this struggle with Europe. Célia, you're brilliant. Your article should be read by all of us. It deserves that. It's a major contribution to the debate. Santiago, refreshing with your brilliant reasoning, with your instigating reasoning on the subtleties of health diplomacy, a refreshing view of diplomats. I want to thank the audience, and we'll all be together next week at 12 with Jarbas Barbosas and Simone Cecchini from CIPAL to discuss together the health dimensions and economic dimensions of the pandemic in Latin America. Please, my dear Deputy Coordinator, big hug for you, Claudia, and all the group from the Global Health Center, and thank you to the